Welcome to the San Miguel Writers Conference Literary Festival Annual Co-Cultural Panel. My name is Louisa Rogers, and I'm your moderator for the panel. This is a panel held every year in which the keynoters explore themes related to culture and literature. And this year, our theme is Our Cultures, Ourselves. We're not going to be discussing exotic cultures off in other lands so much as our own cultures, which are harder to see because we're right in them. They are powerful and yet invisible. And yet they are very interwoven into writing. So a few words about etiquette. Panelists, I would appreciate it if you would keep your comments fairly succinct so that we can make sure, you're laughing, Rita, that's a bad sign. Just so we can make sure everybody has a chance to participate. At the same time, please feel free to ask each other questions if things come up during the conversation. Audience members, we will have a generous question and answer period at the end. So please save your questions, and we will conduct that later. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers. Longer biographies are available in the catalog, but I'm going to briefly introduce them in the order in which they are seated. So, to my immediate left is Joshep Boyden, who is a novelist and short story writer who writes about the First Nations people of Northern Ontario, and he has won numerous awards. Second is Rita Dove, who is a poet and essayist. She's the former U.S. Poet Laureate, the highest honor in the United States, and she has also won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Next to her is John Vaillant, who is a Canadian award-winning author of fiction and nonfiction, writing a great deal about environmental issues and violence in settings all over the world, including Mexico. And finally is Jorge Volpi, a fiction and nonfiction crossing genres writer of Mexican literature who recently won the highest Spanish language award in the Spanish world called the Alfaguara Award. So I'd like to begin by saying a few words about this fuzzy word called culture, this word which is ambiguous and amorphous. It can include such areas as ethnicity, race, gender, language, and much more. So for example, myself, I am an Anglo-Saxon, United States-born, heterosexual woman living in Mexico. In a word, gringa. No es mi culpa. That means it's not my fault. So in that same snapshot, Twitter-esque way, I would like to start off our conversation by asking each of you, in any order you wish to respond, how would you define your culture? Who are you culturally? What is your cultural snapshot? Any of you, please speak into the mic and just share with the audience in whatever order. Thank you.
I'll keep it short. My name is Joseph. It's funny about defining oneself. I think if there's any definition of me, it's exactly the simple sentence I put in the bio of my first novel, 3 Day Road, Joshep Boyden. And I don't speak about myself in the third term. And I'm not Donald Trump. But I am a Canadian of Irish, Scottish, and Métis roots. Irish, Scottish, and Métis roots.
Could you tell those of you who don't know what Métis is?
It's like a Canadian mestizo.
Yeah, it's, yeah.
Canadian.
Indigenous. Mixed European and indigenous Canadian.
Yeah. I think the silence spoke volumes. And I resist trying to define myself in terms of culture, because I've always felt that that all of the cultures were part of my background. You could say I'm African American with some indigenous roots, and yet also a United States citizen, but with a heavy footprint in Europe, in Germany, which is odd, it seems. But there are so many other things that feed into that seems like such an incomplete portrait of any of us that I don't want to go any further. How's that?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to this panel. Well, I am a Mexican citizen. I feel very Mexican. I'm very proud of being Mexican, but I don't feel like a Mexican writer. So I think that I'm only a writer. Later I tell you a little anecdote about this, but I think that I feel myself very proud of being Mexican, but only to be a writer.
Well, boy, I'm really resisting this question. But you and I certainly have really similar, Louisa, really similar, I'm guessing, ethnic and religious roots. And these have all, come out of Northern Europe and been filtered through the New World experience. My family's been on the North American continent for over 400 years. And, we've interacted with all different kinds of people and experiences. So I've lived, in 3 countries for extended periods of time all across North America and in other countries around the world, and picked up wonderful, wonderful gifts from all those places and the people I've overlapped with. And one thing I really, really appreciated being in Oaxaca, Mexico, where my family lived for a year, is that even though I looked so American and was so large and pink, and Oaxaqueños have not been treated kindly on the American border or by many American employers, none of that pain or resentment was passed on to me or my family. And I was allowed to be myself and either enhance the relationship or degrade it. And I was so grateful for being treated, allowed to be just myself, as opposed to being pigeonholed, as they so often are when they cross the border.
Thank you, all of you. Well, the second question, Jorge already kind of answered. And when he says, I believe I heard you say, you consider yourself a writer, not necessarily a Mexican writer, right? I wanted to ask each of you, do you feel that your culture / nationality is part of your identity as a writer, or do you just feel like a universal writer, like like Jorge was implying? Or are you a Canadian writer or a whatever writer? Anyone?
I went first last time.
Let me go for it. Well, I'm going to tell you this little anecdote. I wasn't aware that I was an exotic writer, but suddenly I discovered that. When I was a child, I always wanted to become a scientist. That was my dream. So in the 90s, I decided to write a novel about scientists because I wanted to live this life of a scientist, because I wasn't a scientist, I was a writer. I was studying literature in Spain at the time, PhD in literature in Salamanca in Spain. I was living there. So I started writing this novel about scientists. And suddenly the novel became a novel about the German atomic project during World War II. So I started writing this novel about a character that was engaged in a project at the end of Second World War by the US Army to go to Germany and to search for the German scientists that worked for Hitler trying to build an atomic bomb. when I started this novel, for me it was very natural, so the main character was a Mexican. The main character was the son of a Mexican exile in the United States that studies at Princeton, and then during the World War is engaged in the army, in the US Army, and then goes to Europe trying to look for these German scientists that worked for the German atomic project. But suddenly, at some point of the novel, I decided, I was aware that it was unbelievable to think that a Mexican was trying to look for a German scientist in Germany during World War II. So I decided to change the nationality of the character, and it became American. And I called the character Francis Bacon, and was an American trying to do this job. I published this novel that was, for me, very natural. I only wanted to write a historical novel, a novel about science, without any Mexican characters, for this reason. But when the novel was published, all the praises, but all the criticism towards my novel was because it was a novel without Mexicans, written by a Mexican. So at that point, I discovered that I was an exotic writer. Because for everyone was very strange and crazy that a Mexican wrote a novel without Mexicans. And for me, it was only the decision made to make believable the story. Yes. It wasn't because I doesn't want to be a Mexican writer or not using Mexican characters, but that was the day I discovered that I was an exotic and a Mexican writer.
There you go.
So in my next bio, I'm going to call myself an exotic writer for sure. That's really a good one. I can really live with that. As far as what kind of writer, the longer I'm outside of Massachusetts, where I was born and raised, the more I identify with the New England kind of more 19th century intellectual tradition, where I feel you had people with really good education and intellectual rigor trying to open their minds as wide as they would go. And you can obviously see the limitations in 19th century efforts, but they are who they are, where they are in that period of time. But I really admire the effort, and it's a real challenge, and it's also an invitation and an opportunity, and I really subscribe to that as much as I'm able and as courageously as I'm able to do.
I guess we're going down the line. We did this alphabetically. You realize that? We just sat up here alphabetically. I think that I have always resisted being labeled any kind of writer because the labels were automatically applied to me. So that when I began writing anything, but poetry particularly, I was already deemed an exotic writer. And on many different levels as a woman, and as also, of course, as an African American. And what that label carried, or the reason why I resisted it, was because it carried with it certain presumptions of what that exotic writer could do, exactly. And so that I've had people accuse me of not writing about being black because the person didn't mention being black or anything in the poem. I've written short stories where the characters were male and everyone assumed that they were female and couldn't understand the masturbation scene because even though it was called, the spray paint king, hint, gender. But so it was always these I always felt like it was a little bit out of sync, so let's keep it out of sync and insist upon the entire humanity. And I understand fully what you're saying about the scientists, that people would not understand or would not believe that the Mexican character would be interested in science. It's been my lifelong goal to thwart those presumptions wherever I can. So I don't identify myself as any kind of writer. People are busy telling me all the time what I am. I'll just keep writing and they can say whatever they want.
I'm a nomad. I've spent 25 years of my life living in New Orleans in Louisiana, which is not really an American city so much as a banana republic existing in the southern part of the United States. It's, we call New Orleans the northernmost port of the Caribbean, and there's a reason for that. And there's a reason I was attracted to that city. I went there for the first time as a roadie for a punk rock band when I was 18. 6 stinking young men traveling across America in mid-July in a dark van. And I remember the morning, we started in South Carolina and we eventually made it to New Orleans. I remember early in the morning rolling that van door open, and I thought the van stunk, but when the Mississippi River hit my nose, and it felt like I was stepping into the mouth of an overheated and panting dog, I knew this is the city for me. And I really did fall in love with that place. I fell in love with a woman there, married her, maintain really strong ties to that city, and I learned to become a writer there in my mid-20s. And I'm a Canadian. I was born and raised in the suburbs of Toronto, and we spent much of our life up on Georgian Bay, Lake Simcoe, North Bay, all of the Great Lakes. My father was a doctor, I'll talk about tonight, who loved just getting out on the water, and that's what we did. But I'm a nomad, and I think of myself as, I have dual citizenship. I'm a Canadian, I'm American, I'm a North American, I am a mixed blood person. But I don't want to narrow myself down either, and that's what I'm hearing from everyone, is we're writers. The act of fiction means to open up something that you can't with nonfiction, and that's how that's how I choose to look at myself, as somebody who tries to open up and push against and sometimes lie for the bigger truth of fiction. And that's what's important to me, is how do I capture that in those voices that come to me.
Interesting how every question that I ask segues into another one, and we keep overlapping like a Venn diagram. Well, in this question I wanted to ask, and you've already touched on it, but what other cultures besides the culture of your roots have informed or affected your writing? If you haven't mentioned, I'd like to hear any others that you have been exposed to or lived in.
I'll go first this time, so that I don't have to go first the next time. I would say that German culture has really affected me deeply, and I mentioned earlier, I know that sounds odd, but to me it doesn't seem very odd at all. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, and if I were to say anywhere, where my roots are, where I feel most connected immediately, it would be Akron, Ohio, which was a place that was, it's right there almost on Lake Erie, so we felt Canada to the north. I always felt like I had one foot ready to escape if I wanted to. And yet, it was on this pipeline of the industrial, the industrial pipeline. We made tires and they went off to Detroit, and then the cars went off and lived the American dream. But because of all of that, I always felt that I was at a crossroads culturally, and it felt really good. There were so many Germans, Czechs, and Hungarian immigrants in Akron and in Cleveland at the time, and they came in the 19th century, most of them, not because of the wars. So that my next door neighbor was a Hungarian woman who told me she was from Székesfehérvár, and I was determined I was going to find this place before, I stepped off this earth. And didn't think that was odd, that she was from Székesfehérvár. She taught me how to say it, it was great. And we sang German and French songs, because there were also many women who had come from the islands up. We sang them in school. And so German was not a foreign sound in my ears. In fact, I went to Ferdinand Schumacher elementary school, and he was the man who discovered rolled oats. So every time you eat your oats in the morning, Akron, Ohio, but also Germany. So that's one of the cultures that just, and then I met my husband through absolute wonderful serendipity, which now seems totally fated, but you know, I was going to translate a lecture of his, and so we met over language, and it's just part of me.
Well, I'd have to say Navajo. One in particular, a book by Leslie Marmon Silko called Ceremony that was introduced to me when I was 19, and just, you know, that and Moby Dick really rocked my world, and became two books that I wanted to try to write someday. And Ceremony, if you haven't read it, is just so beautiful and so much about becoming whole again, which, you know, given the immigrant tradition, the immigrant history, and the fracturing of the indigenous world in North America, being whole is, you know, in some ways our collective project. And Leslie Marmon Silko shows the way. So that, her, and then for the Jaguar's children, I'd have to say, you know, Borges and Octavio Paz, you know, so Latin American writers. And again, it's and you know, Melville had at this access too, these access to kind of multi-layered spirit worlds, animal worlds. It wasn't just kind of set in this kind of domestic human chamber. It was much more porous, which I think is the reality of existence, and the one that I feel the most keenly and fills me with the most excitement. And so the writers who are able to access that and move through the membrane. And really briefly, another writer friend of mine, we were both talking about our experience in Oaxaca, and he says, you know, the membrane is just thinner there. And it's just easier to access these other dimensions of being and experience. And that's where I go.
Well, my grandfather was Italian, but he died before I was born. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my father, who died 3 years ago. Sorry. My father was born in Mexico City, and he never went to Italy, but he felt like he was an Italian trapped in Mexico. He never went to Italy. He studied Italian at school because his father didn't talk to him in Italian. I speak Italian too because my father wanted that their children studied Italian. And it was very crazy to be in this house because we were absolutely Mexican, but chili and beans were banned from my home. So my father thought that this was too Mexican. So we ate pasta and risotto and these kind of things in Mexico. My father at lunch, he always talked to us about Italian and French history, never about Mexican history. So it was really crazy to be an exotic Mexican in this kind of way because we were Mexicans. He knew very well the streets of Rome and of Milan. And I think that was very important for me because I felt Mexican, but at the same time I felt too that I had another home, another imaginary home that was the home of my grandfather that I never met.
Wow.
And you say imaginary home, and right away that's the world I lived in. I'm from a very large family, and my escape was reading the Encyclopedia Britannica at the age of 7, from A to Z, skipping most of X because it was super boring. But I'd lock myself in the bathroom and read the encyclopedia, and I was introduced to worlds not my own, with sisters and brothers pounding on the door, let me in, and I became lost in these imaginary worlds. And I think my mother was a school teacher, and she made sure to read to all of us. We'd pile on the bed like little wolf puppies around my mom, who would read to us every afternoon and then in the evening, and brought worlds to us. And so I'm going to say, as cliche as it is, I feel like a citizen of the world because of what my mother introduced us to. Even though I was too afraid to travel to Europe until I was well into my 30s, I still feel like in some ways I'm a citizen of the world, and this is the world that I want to write about.
Are there aspects of whatever culture you identify with that you avoid writing about?
The Irish, I went first there.
You.
Oh, no, I'm actually not kidding. People have asked me in the past, well, you write about the Native American or Native Canadian experience, but you're mostly Irish. When are you going to write about Ireland? I'm like, I've been to Dublin once for 24 hours, and I was drunk the whole time, and I remember nothing of it. So it's going to be a while.
Let someone else do that for you. It's all right. I think that I avoided writing about the personal trajectory, I guess you could say, of my African-American experience until I could feel like I could handle it, if that makes any sense. So what I was doing was, I think the first 2 books were my practice books so I could write the poems about my grandparents. I was so worried that they would be immediately catapulted into this exotic, African-American experience and become symbols instead of 2 human beings trying to put together a marriage. And I had been taught, we ate soul food at home, so they didn't take away our beans or our rice or anything like that. But we also were taught to dress really well and never, and be polite and always be clean and always present a pristine appearance that no one could say that you were an animal or you were just a dirty little Negro child. And that brings with it a certain shield that I think I'm still, I was still working through. But it took about 2 books before I could write about my working class grandparents. Yeah.
There's a Canadian Filipino writer named Miguel who was writing, I think he was interning, for Men's Journal or maybe Esquire, and they had him interview Jonathan Dee, the American fiction writer. I think he teaches at Columbia now. And we're talking about, writing fiction, and so many times, supposedly, no one ever said it to me, but people have said, write what you know. And I really can't think of anything more boring. And with all due respect to people who are writing about what they know, just what I know really well isn't that interesting. And I'd really much rather find out about somebody else's. And but what the quote that Jonathan Dee gave to Miguel Sujuku that just really felt like was a wonderful affirmation for me was, well, I tell my students, write what you don't know. Challenge yourself to make that the empathic leap, the research leap. To go there and try on this other skin and get into it. And lots of other people have spoken of that in different ways eloquently over this week, this wonderful week. But write what you don't know is really my modus operandi. So upper middle class Massachusetts, I don't think I'll ever write about it. If those of you were here yesterday afternoon, that's about as much as I have to say about it. So.
Well, I agree absolutely with you, John, about that. I avoid writing magical realism. Why? Because I admire a lot Garcia Marquez, but at some point, every Latin American writer has the obligation to become a magical realist. The success of Garcia Marquez was so amazing that suddenly, everywhere outside Latin America, it was the impression that Garcia Marquez was a realist writer. Because in Latin America, everything is magical. So we have to always think that here in San Miguel de Allende or everywhere in Mexico, we have some kind of magic. So we and my friends decided not to write magical realism, only to show that Latin America has this realism that is completely different from the imagination of Garcia Marquez.
Yes.
Can I build on that? So we were down in Oaxaca, and that's another place where people talk a lot about magical realism, and I realized really shortly after getting there that there's really nothing magical about it. It's just realism, and they just experience it differently. And I remember when I was younger and I looking at Japanese art, which I really loved, and I thought, wow, those artists, they have such a great imagination. You know, the way they draw things and all those curly cues on the roofs and, you know, where do they get that, you know? And then I went to Japan. I thought, oh my God, you know, they're just drawing what they see, you know? There's no imagination at all. It's completely real. And that was really a learning for me, but also, you know, exactly what you're saying, because Marquez was a journalist, right?
Yes.
And so he's reporting.
So no more magical realism.
No.
All right. I just want to remind you, if you want to ask each other any questions, you feel free as we go along. Okay. Do you feel any responsibility as a writer to either educate or correct misassumptions or change perceptions about any cultures you identify with?
In the second draft. Like, I'm not going to sit down and write a novel that takes me a long time to write because I'm slow saying I'm going to wield the hammer of authority, dear reader, and I will teach you a lesson and you will be forever changed by my brilliant writing. I stumble through the darkness till I have a draft of a book done. And then I go back and say, oh, look, these characters are possibly doing something that I've recognized or experienced or have seen in the world, and these characters are, if I do it right, and if the characters speak right, they will naturally carry any kind of education that I don't set out to educate, though. I set out to entertain. I write my novels for my family. My two younger brothers are firefighters. You know, one of them said the last book he read was Conan the Barbarian, and so I set out to write a book that he will pick up and say, oh, it's kind of a fun adventure story. You know, so I don't set out to educate, but I realize that the characters begin to do that for me.
Yes, I think that we live in a world of cliches and simplifications. So, well, yes, one of the missions of the writers is trying to avoid these cliches and simplifications. For example, I remember that when I arrived into Spain for studying this PhD in literature, I hated when everyone asked me where I was born. I say I was Mexican, and they started to imitate the Mexican accent, as in the commercials, diciendo que todos hablamos así. So saying that we always talked like Speedy Gonzales. And I tried to show them that that wasn't right. I spent 3 years in Spain. I came back to Mexico, and suddenly I heard people in Mexico talking, and everyone was talking like Speedy Gonzales. But this is a joke. But there are also other simplifications that are really awful. For example, violence in Mexico. So every time I go outside Mexico, and maybe for you it's the same. So yes, we live in a very violent country. We live in a country where we have a lot of deaths and disparitions related to the war on drugs. It's an awful situation, and we have to be very aware of that. But we don't live in Mexico, in the whole country, like if we live in a state of war. We are here. We are in a very peaceful, beautiful town also. So we have to show that there are differences and nuances that are not the simplification of, for example, Trump saying that this is the most violent country in the world, for example.
I felt too, I come from Charlottesville, Virginia now. That's my home, and everyone knows where Charlottesville, Virginia is now. Before, they never did. And I find myself trying to explain that Charlottesville, Virginia is like every other city in the world or any other town. It could happen anywhere, that kind of violence. What I've been made aware of, and I've always felt, first of all, I've always felt that I do bear a responsibility, but toward educating, toward breaking down cliches. How one does that, though, as a writer, the best way I can do it is to write the best damn poem I can, which means being honest, which means being as true to the language as I can, and keeping the language alive and vibrant. And what Trump does is, of course, deaden that language and narrow it and take away your vocabulary and change the words so that we begin to explain away every word that should be normal and accepted. And as writers, that is my cross. That's one of the things I'm going to bear. That also means writing something that anyone would pick up too, if that's the way you write. If that's the way you can do it, then that needs to be done. But it also needs to be done, that someone will write a poem that will make us think and maybe think again. Maybe someone else doesn't like it, or maybe so. There's all sorts of room for that kind of education. But I think as writers, we are living examples of the idea to bear the responsibility of human consciousness to the page.
I feel really committed to conveying accurate information, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. I want it to be accurate, and what felt like a great failing to me was I got a really lovely review from a Southwestern NPR station about the Jaguars' children, and in the review, this wonderful person was saying, Vaillant teaches us this and he teaches us that about, Hector's world, and it was teach and teach and teach and more teaching, and I just thought, oh God, I would never pick that book up, and I really felt it felt like a failure to me, that it was that on the nose, and it may be, but that's certainly not the intention, and I don't. That doesn't seem like so that in terms of as far as informing, you want it to be almost incidental and after the fact, or the image that came to my mind the other day was this notion of a beautiful dog running through a field in the autumn, and our eyes are watching this beautiful dog move across the landscape, and we can't take our eyes off it. But as that dog is running, it's picking up all the birds and seeds and all kinds of other things that are in that field. And as we follow it on that journey, all those bits and pieces that are germs of new bits of information are attaching itself to this irresistibly charismatic event. And that to me is what a successful book looks like. So you get all that information almost beside the point without necessarily having signed up for that. And I think it's really, in my case, I'm hoping to entertain, but have the information kind of come in this osmotic way.
I have a question. How do you prevent that dog by the end of the journey not being so heavily covered in burrs and everything else that he has to go to the vet and get shaved, kind of thing? How do you keep him? He has to be somewhat streamlined.
I think that's for the editor. You really got to count it. You don't want the reader to tell you that. This is where the editor is supposed to save you from yourself and all your good intentions. And it's a liability for me.
The editor is veterinarian.
Yeah, exactly. Or hairdresser. Yeah.
Hairdresser.
Am I correct that, Jorge, you are the only one of the four who is still living in the place of your birth? Or maybe you are?
Yes, right now, yes. Yeah. Well, I live abroad from Mexico for 10 years in the United States, Spain, France, and Italy. But now I'm back in Mexico City. Yeah.
Okay. So mobility, which is sort of part of this whole overlaps with culture, I think. The rest of you three have moved, And one of you is still, and I think this is quite unusual actually in many parts of the world today, that you're in the same place today, decades after you were born. Does being in the same place have anything to help shape your writing, or does mobility shape your writing? Any of you?
In my case, oops. I was just going to say I didn't think that the geography really mattered that much, but I do think where you are matters, and all the stories that I've been given, and I really see them as gifts, came from because of where I was. And the tiger and the golden spruce came to me because I was in a certain place in Canada at a certain time, and that story came to me. And the jaguar's children came to me because I was in Mexico at a certain time, and that story came to me. That said, as far as corporeally speaking, I'm really up for living anywhere. And I wish I felt more rooted, and I feel a deep connection to New England, just because there's, the way the grass looks after the snow has been lying on it all season, the way that looks, and the way, summer shade, under maples, there's no other kind of light like that. There's no other way the grass lies like that, and I just know it, and it touches me every time I see it, which isn't that often. And but I'd move down here in a second. So.
I think that, actually, I've been living in the same place for 29 years, something like that, in Virginia, Charlottesville, Virginia. Before that, it was Arizona for 8 years, where I've experienced that sense of missing something, because when it became September and the leaves didn't turn and the air didn't crisp, I felt absolutely bereft. And I realized it was just connected to me, but it does not necessarily have to be in Ohio or in Virginia. I feel I need the change of seasons. Having said that, I think that for me, I've always felt that no matter where I lived, there was a connection with my African American roots, because it is a diasporic experience, and the way you say or greet someone or know that you're home has been through certain things that have been passed on, such as music, such as singing, or dancing, or just being able, a certain nod on the street, which I can feel immediately at home no matter where I am in the world. And so I have cousins who live in Georgia who would, that came up en masse to work in the rubber factories, so they carried the accent with them. And we speak in Southern accents in Akron whenever everybody gets together. But when everybody doesn't get together, we just drift right back out into our specific, sensibilities. So I always felt the family is there. My whole family's on the road.
Well, the Mexico where I live now is not the Mexico where I was born. So it's a different country. It's a completely different country, because when I was young, Mexico was a very complicated country, as in all the countries in Latin America, but it was mainly a peaceful country. And after some years abroad in the United States, in Spain, in France, this Mexico is another country. It's a country in war. It's a country with this violence, related with the war on drugs. So after 2006, this is a different country. So for me, it's like living in another country that wasn't my Mexico when I was young.
Jorge, I really am resonating to that in a really sad way. I left the U.S. in '98. There were not a lot of people emigrating out of the United States in 1998. The stock market was at all-time high. Clinton was president, for better or worse, but there was not a lot of motive to leave, and we went kind of by accident. But now, it really does. It seems like a different country. It's more like what you're describing about Mexico. It's absolutely sickening, and the intellectual violence, the political violence, on top of the really pointless bloodshed. And it's, so, yeah, how, I can never go back to that. I mean, you can never go back to childhood either, but the U.S. That I thought I knew, it also feels like a different country.
I think my novels on the surface are very labeled Canadian novels for their content and their peoples. But I've said before, and especially when I was a younger writer, that psychic and geographic distance, I really needed that to write about my country. I left Canada not as an expatriate, but as a Canadian living in a banana republic. And I always go back. You know, family pulls you back, and the landscape, the land pulls me back, the geography. But I've always needed that psychic and geographic distance. But now, for personal reasons, I'm going back home, and I know you can't go back home again, but I'm back in Ontario, and it's like, ooh, what's going to happen now? You know, maybe I'm the older, more mature writer. We shall see. Or maybe I'll just start writing about Ireland.
Ireland's waiting.
It's been done.
There are a lot of very heated issues in the international world right now that bear on culture. Issues related to nationalism, gender fluidity, Me Too, various things like that. And I just wondered if those at all touch on your writing, or are you just writing in your own, you know, airtight container, or how those affect, if they do?
For me, I mean, as a writer, how can they not touch me? Poetry is about life. However you choose to interpret that, but for me, it's going to seep into the writing in some way. I don't sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write about the Me Too movement right now. I'm not going to do this. And in fact, often when I am most outraged, that's when I feel the most helpless in my writing. So that psychic distance that you were talking about, Joseph, is something that everyone has to negotiate on themselves. I find that I need time, or that I don't quite know how it's going to enter the work. I just have to be there. I need to be in a place where I know people. I need to be in a place where I can walk down the street and I can say hi to someone. I can't lock myself off, but that's just me. I can't go somewhere to write. I would just sit there looking at stuff going, wow, this is kind of nice, but I'm not going to write because I'm not connected, so.
Yeah, I really resonate with that image of the current event, that wherever you are, seeping in. And all my books have been about, all three of them, have been about current or very recent events. And so they're about what's going on right now. And they're, you know, all of them are, you know, connected to larger issues just because, frankly, most things are connected to larger issues. And if you really explore it and unpack it, you're going to see echoes and reflections across the globe, you know, whether it's about logging or tigers or immigration. You know, these are all those concerns have their own, they reproduce themselves in every place where those beings exist. So I think one can't help but be, and the way the stories, you know, I get the sense that you get visited too, Rita, and there's, you know, you're not always choosing what you're writing about. You know, the story comes and touches you on the shoulder or calls you by phone and just lets you know, this is the one, and better not fight it.
Two of my novels are historical novels, and it was only after the fact that I realized that they rang contemporarily, and I don't think in a bad way, but I think it made me think about historical novels and some of my favorites, and looking back and saying, oh, they are making as much a commentary on the here and now as they are on 400 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 50 years ago. And the characters, all humans, we're the same now as we were 500 years ago. We have our desires and our hatreds and our wants and our needs and our foibles. But I think things do kind of filter through that are happening contemporarily into some of my books. I remember at one point in the Orenda, some guy drove by in a car, and I was like, oh, I better remove that. The Orenda takes place in the 1600s, so that didn't happen. But sometimes things you have to kind of force away the contemporary and enter into that past world with the realization that they're very, very human wants and desires do not change over time. The technology does, though.
I think too, it's as a poet mostly, I'd say that I notice that people tend to approach poems and think, okay, that's about something else. You know that there's, that this is going to be a metaphor for something else. And so I'd say that if you write about what moves you or what has spoken into your ear or what you cannot get rid of, what haunts you, it's going to be about something that touches everybody else. To sit there and say, okay, I really want to write about this event. I'm talking poetry right now, and not something that you can put, that you have a plot and characters and can work that all the facts in. But you say, dare I write about flowers? Well, in a world in which flowers are not valued, that's an intensely political poem, right? So you don't second guess it. You write the thing, and you write it, as best you can, and it's going to be about everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I really admire those writers that write only about themselves or their love stories or their imagination. But for me, it's almost impossible. Even when I write historical novels, there are always historical novels about our time, not about the past.
Yeah.
Is there anything any of you want to address that we haven't talked on, that you'd like to just bring up?
What's your middle name, Rita?
Like,
What's your middle name?
My middle name, Francis.
Oh.
And my mother always called me Rita Francisco.
I can hear that. Francisco, I see.
Yeah.
So there is a Latin
Anthony.
connection.
Anthony.
Anthony. Ah.
And you? What's your middle name?
Luis.
Luis, that's a nice one.
And John, what's yours?
Well, it's Holden. Yes. Cleveland,
Yes.
those Holdens.
Those Holdens.
Holden.
Okay. But it's an important question. Because you live with your
beautiful
name.
names,
Yes,
actually.
we're good. Let's make up a new.
Anthony, Francisco, Holden,
Luis.
Luis. I think Luis
Francis.
should come
That's
first.
my new nom de plume.
Let's make up an author who writes that pseudonym. We've got it. You heard it
An
here.
author of the world.
Yes.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience. And we have a mic. If you would come up here so you can take the mic and come forward so everybody can hear you. You can line up.
It'd be a great disappointment, too.
Be sure and speak into the mic.
I just want to follow up on your last question and your answers. What's in a name? How much do you know about why your parents gave you the names that they gave you? My middle name is Charity, and that's quite unusual. But boy, did I learn a lot finding out why.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anybody?
Well, it really is. I was about to say that we do, when we're children, I don't know about you, but I was obsessed with what my name meant and how it was going to predict who I was going to be. Because you're looking for all sorts of clues to how to be an adult when you're a child. And so I know that my mother named me Rita after Rita Hayworth because she was pregnant and feeling bad, and she saw Rita Hayworth film, and she said, I want a girl who's as spicy as that. She was eating milk and magnesia cakes at the time, trying to keep herself down. And also my father's name is Ray, and in that kind of patriarchal society, every child was named with an R. So I had to be an R. My brother was Ray, and then I have 2 sisters. whose also names are with R. And Dove, it's my name. It really is my name. It came probably from the Cherokee. We have roots in Georgia, but no one really knows. But I have met some of the white doves. It's interesting.
The white doves.
The white doves, yeah. We were the brown. Oh, you know. Okay.
Others? Your name? The reason why you were given the name? you were
Well,
given?
my father was called Jorge too, so it's easy. But the question is why my father is called Jorge? Because my father has an aunt who had 5 different spouses, 5 different that died one after the other. So my grandmother decided to call Jorge, my father, as one of these guys that died before he was born. But the aunt hated my father because he was called Jorge, as his former,
As her former.
yes, husband. Yeah.
Oh, God.
Well, my son's middle name and my sister's middle name is a lot more interesting. It's Liberty, and it dates from the American Revolution when a very enthusiastic male ancestor who's about to be a dad said, "We're going to name the boy Liberty," and his very sensible wife said, "You know, we might lose." And so we're going to call him Peter. And so Liberty became a middle name, and it's been a middle name ever since. So.
That's awesome.
I'm going to speak to names a little bit tonight, so I'm going to keep my powder dry.
Another question from the audience came up, and I don't know if any of you can address it. Do you have an opinion on feminism, especially as it is occurring in North America, here in our part of the world? Anybody?
I know who that's addressed to.
Sorry?
I said, I know who that's addressed to. No, it's another case of a word that's been taken and made into something that is too hot to handle, when we all should be talking about what it means to be female, male, gendered, anything, and how, and what kind of political or social pressures then get applied to that existence. So that, to me, is what feminism is. It's making us aware of that. I think that, as Jorge says, all of these things are much more complicated than what we can take care of in this venue. But I will say that though I absolutely applaud what's happening in the Me Too movement in terms of these things coming out, I also think that we have to be very careful not to get into any kind of mob mentality. I've seen that in, well, we've all seen that in very different dimensions. In other words, not to think in a kind of a general sense about anything, but to weigh each case and to be aware that every person, each one of us is capable of slipping into a mob mentality, all for the right reasons. So we have to be really, really diligent about this. On the other hand, the only way, I feel, to move through this is to keep talking about it and all of the uncomfortableness, I guess, for lack of a better word, that brings up. We need to talk about race, we need to talk about gender, we need to talk about rape culture, we need to talk about drugs, and also admit that all of us have inside of us the tendency to want to make it go away by saying that this person is completely evil, that person is completely good, and let's just string that one up.
Okay. I at least did not think that question was necessarily directed at you, Rita. I truly believe feminism is a topic that is completely democratic and is something to be discussed by every gender, however many we are. And if anybody else wants to comment, please do.
My mother was really involved in the women's movement in the early 70s, and it was sort of really front and center for me as a small child, and detonated in my parents' marriage, and it was been really interesting to watch her struggles and her journey over the past 40 years, and she comes from enormous privilege, and still, is in some ways kind of impaired by her circumstance. And I think feminism today has come to mean a different thing than it did 40 years ago. And but the theme that I've seen and felt through those 40 years that or actually closer to 50 years now, that I've been aware of it at one level or another, is it comes back to human rights and civil rights. And it comes back really to being seen, really about being seen and heard and felt. And that, obviously all of us need that, but I do think there are, just thinking about my grandmother and her incredible intelligence, and her job was to help serve her husband's dream. And one of the reasons he was so successful is because of her. And, she never really got her due. I think she actually got a co-authorship when they revised the book after he died. The Aztecs of Mexico that I spoke of yesterday. But still, it's, kind of there's that second fiddle role. And so being able to be seen fully and individually, it's something that all of us need and desire. And that's another, I think one of the missions and the challenges of the artist is to be able to do that. And I see those limitations in my own work.
I'm so trying to keep my powder dry for my talk tonight, but I got to share with you. I was raised by my school teacher mother and 7 older birth sisters. And so, yes, feminism's really important.
Hearing family members mentioned makes me realize that one area we haven't talked about, although it's certainly been discussed a great deal in the places I've been in during the conference, is family, which is another piece of culture that is also going through huge transition. And I would love to hear, except for you, I want to protect your keynote, but other than Joshep, I'd love to hear about both from your parents' point of view and your children's and siblings, anything about how your larger family has affected your writing, positively or not, at all generational levels.
I come from a family of scientists and people and book enthusiasts. So my father is a chemist. My two sisters, one was a chemist, the other is a computer scientist, my brother's a computer scientist. Science is all around me. And my mother she graduated high school at 16 and then was not allowed to take a scholarship to Howard because her parents thought she was a young girl who shouldn't go into the city. So there was this extremely intelligent woman who really loved to read, was very smart, but also dedicated her life to making both her husband but her children's lives better. And I think that my father, on the other hand, I said he was a chemist, but he was not, he became the first research chemist in the rubber industry, the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, only because his classmates, who he had tutored in organic chemistry, his white classmates, finally prevailed upon the bosses to give him a job. He ran the elevator. And so he did this for years. Now, I did not know this. My brother did not know this. My sisters did not know this. I did not know this until I was in college. And when it came out, and I said, how could you keep this from us? He said, I didn't want you to grow up bitter. I wanted you to grow up believing that you had this chance, and then, then you will believe that you have. And it was true. I mean, I think by the time that I knew about it, I had a certain kind of confidence that I don't think I would have had if I had not been kept shielded by that. So, and my mother was, they loved reading and everything. So that was my immediate family. Here comes this poet who was supposed to be a credit to a race. And poetry wasn't in that, in the stars of what means to be credit to a race. So I think I told my mother first, and she said, you tell your father. But wait until he's had his highball. And so she gave him his drink, and then I went in and I told my father that I was going to be a poet. I was a junior in college, I think, and they thought I was going to be a lawyer. That's what I told them before that. But to his credit, he just put down his paper and he said, okay, I don't understand poetry. Don't be upset if I don't read it. That was like a ticket to heaven. I said, fine. But there were some great storytellers in my larger family, so they were cool with it. And then I had a brother-in-law who would report and say, I saw him with your book, or I see from the smudge marks, he did read halfway through that book at least, So, it worked out. Thank you.
Writing for my family, an extended family, really was a family value. And my grandfather, named John, my mother's dad, had every issue of the New Yorker bound and on a prominent shelf going back to the 1920s. And grew up with that magazine, and it really was as familiar to me as Mother Goose. And I started reading it, ever since I could turn a page, and I'd look at the ads and read the cartoons. And, around age of 40 or so, I started to read the articles. But there was... that was, no one really said anything about it, but that was the peak, really. And along with that, the number of books, written by my immediate family and extended family members would probably fill a shelf or two. And they've been doing it for generations. And there's a lot of juice back there. Though no novelists, and also many aspiring writers, and everybody could talk, and everybody could write, and everybody was funny, and so the word was incredibly powerful, and that was the thing you needed to be able to wield to be a player in the family. And so, for me, to get published in the New Yorker really kind of settled a lot of doubts, whatever doubts my family might have had about me, and I had a very checkered beginning. And did not look like a really hopeful prospect. And I'm not trying to be funny. It was, wasn't looking good. And it took a while to get it together. But, doing that, I sort of felt like, wish my grandmother could have seen that. Wish my grandfather could have seen that. And it wasn't just, you made your first million, son. It was really you kind of also fulfilled a dream, a family dream. And there was such a reverence for good writing and for humor and just for being able to really articulate yourself, which I still have trouble doing. And that's, I couldn't have avoided it really. I'm just kind of following a collective destiny, I feel.
The New Yorker pays well, but it doesn't pay that well, does it?
Well, that's why I stopped. That's why, seriously.
Well, when my father died, I wrote a book about him. Examen de mi padre is that book. It's more like anatomy of my father. That is a book also about my mother and a book about myself. I have also a brother who prohibited me directly to write about him. So I'm thinking about writing my next book about him.
Thank you. There are a couple questions over here.
Call him Jorge.
Well, Jorge, that kind of answered a little bit of my question. What I wanted to ask all of you is, I know at the beginning we spoke about how people told you that you were an exotic writer and you didn't necessarily want to be, and then you were expected. I know, Joseph, you've taken some heat for what you've written about. Lots of times people tell us what we can and can't write about, You all are very lauded and storied writers. You've gotten prizes, you've gotten your books out. What advice would you give someone who's not quite where you are about when people tell us what we can and can't write about? What advice would you give?
Don't listen.
Yeah, that's about it.
I have 2 words too, but they're different.
It's really,
Anyone else on that? Okay.
we're in agreement.
Any other questions? I just want to thank you all. You were such a fun and group. I felt like I was dealing with a bunch of friendly civs.
What's your middle name? I never
What?
asked. What's your middle name?
Oh, well, my full name is Sarah with an H, very important. Sarah Louisa Rogers, but I was always called Louisa because my mother was a Sarah and they didn't want to have 2 Sarahs in the family. Here in Mexico, they get totally confused because L-O, they start saying Louisa. And I say, no, it's Louisa, but they spell it with an O. Anyway, and it means battle maiden. Battle maiden.
Oh,
Yeah.
man, yes.
Well, it was a terrific group. Let's give them a hand.